The scent of raw Douglas fir and pulverized concrete is something that gets under your fingernails and never quite washes out. It was a Tuesday, the kind of blistering afternoon where the heat radiates off the unfinished plywood subfloors, baking the sawdust into the sweat on your neck. I was the only woman framing on a massive residential complex, a 5-story skeleton of timber and ambition. Navigating a job site like that meant walking a razor-thin tightrope. If a guy bumped my shoulder or stole my material, I had to calculate my reaction in a split second. Snap at him, and I'm permanently branded a hysterical bitch. Stay quiet, and I become a doormat. It was a relentless game of chess played in steel-toed boots, and I refused to lose. The day started with the ladders. On a sprawling framing site, ladders are treated like communal property, abandoned wherever the last guy finished his task. We were moving linearly, finishing one floor and pushing upward. Tired of tripping over fiberglass A-frames, I took 30 minutes to gather every single ladder scattered across the 3rd floor. I stacked them meticulously against the shear wall, organized by height, creating a neat, centralized hub. Satisfied, I grabbed my personal 6-footer, hauled my pneumatic nail gun over my shoulder, and got to work bracing the shear panels. 30 minutes later, the gun hissed, spitting dry air. I was out of ring-shank nails. A fresh supply meant a trip down to the Connex, the giant metal shipping container acting as our armory, parked in the dirt lot outside. 5 flights of temporary wooden stairs down, 3 10-pound boxes of galvanized nails loaded into my arms. 5 flights of stairs back up. By the time I breached the 5th floor, my thighs burned, my lungs pulled at the dusty air, and my forearms felt like lead. I dropped the heavy cardboard boxes with a solid thud against the plywood, swiped a forearm across my dripping forehead, and turned to grab my ladder. It was gone. I blinked through the grit in my eyes. The space where I had left it, mere inches from my nail gun, was empty. A slow, hot prickle of irritation crawled up the back of my neck. I spun around, scanning the chaotic expanse of half-built walls. 50 yards away, standing comfortably on my heavily marked, paint-splattered 6-footer, was Bram. Bram was a journeyman carpenter whose reputation for flawless rafter cuts was matched only by his infuriatingly smug demeanor. He had shoulders like an ox, calloused hands that could palm a framing square, and a habit of looking at me with a perpetually amused glint in his dark eyes that always made me want to throw a hammer at his head. I marched over, my boots crunching heavily on the scattered debris. I stopped at the base of the ladder, crossing my arms. He paused, lowering his drill, and looked down at me. "You took my ladder," I stated, keeping my voice deadpan, refusing to let the anger crack my composure. He leaned against the top rung, wiping a smudge of dirt from his jaw. "Needed to run some blocking." "There is a literal mountain of ladders." I pointed toward the neat stack I had built on the far side of the floor. "Right over there. Why didn't you just take one from the pile?" Bram gave a lazy, broad-shouldered shrug. A maddening smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Why can't you?" The sheer audacity of it left a metallic taste in my mouth. If the roles were reversed, if I had walked up, stolen the ladder out from under him while a dozen unused ones sat in plain sight, I would have been chewed out in front of the entire crew. I would have had to take it on the chin, apologize, and retreat. The double standard was a suffocating weight, but I knew better than to blow up. Yelling would only entertain him. "Right," I said, my voice dangerously soft. I held his gaze for a long, heavy second, memorizing the cocky slant of his smile, before turning on my heel and walking away. I didn't grab a ladder from the pile. I waited. The simmering rage calcified into something cold, sharp, and highly creative. At 10 o'clock, the shrill blast of the air horn signaled break time. The crew scattered like roaches, most heading down to the roach coaches parked on the street or retreating to their trucks for a smoke. I didn't leave the floor. Instead, I slipped inside the nearest portable toilet. The plastic walls radiated heat, the air thick with the acrid stench of blue chemicals, but I held my breath and cracked the plastic door just enough to keep an eye on the perimeter. Once the floor was dead quiet, I slipped out. I knew exactly where Bram kept his gear. He always dropped his heavy leather tool pouches near the main structural pillar before heading down for break. The pouches were heavy-duty, worn soft from years of use, secured around the waist like a weightlifter's belt, loaded with squares, hammers, chalk lines, and a small fortune in hand tools. I knelt beside the leather rig. I wasn't going to damage his property. Slashing leather or breaking tools crossed the line from a prank to vandalism. I needed something far more psychological, something that demanded respect. I grabbed my impact driver and a handful of lag screws from my vest. Lags aren't regular screws. They are massive, thick bolts with coarse, biting threads meant to bite deep into solid timber. I found the pre-punched holes in the leather belt, the ones meant for adjusting the waist size. I lined them up against the subfloor. The floor here was going to be covered in gypcrete, a thick layer of liquid flooring by the end of the month so a few holes in the plywood wouldn't matter. I squeezed the trigger on the impact driver. The harsh, ratcheting clatter echoed through the empty floor as a 4-inch lag bit through the leather hole and buried itself into the plywood. I moved to the thick metal ringlets meant for hanging hammers. 6-inch lag, 8-inch lag. I drove them deep, pinning the heavy leather rig immovably to the floor. To top it off, I took my framing hammer and bent the exposed heads of the screws over, folding the metal so that a drill couldn't easily grip them. To get his belt back, he wouldn't just have to unscrew them. He'd have to fight the coarse grips with a pair of pliers, millimeter by agonizing millimeter. I stood up, dusted my knees, and vanished back to my section just as the air horn blasted the end of break. I busied myself with my nail gun, keeping my back turned but my peripheral vision locked on the central pillar. The crew filtered back up the stairs, laughing and grumbling. Bram strolled in, a cup of black coffee in one hand. He set the cup on a windowsill and reached down to scoop up his pouches by the suspenders in one fluid, practiced motion. He yanked upward. His arm jerked down violently, nearly dislocating his shoulder as the immovable belt defied gravity. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper. Bram stopped. He looked at his hand, then down at the floor. He crouched. I saw the moment his brain processed the bent, heavy-duty lag screws pinning his livelihood to the subfloor. A lesser man would have thrown a tantrum, screamed for the foreman, or kicked a wall. Bram did none of those things. He stayed crouched for a long moment, tracing the bent head of an 8-inch lag with his thumb. Then he let out a low, booming laugh that rumbled across the open floor plan. He didn't look around to see who was watching. He didn't demand a culprit. He simply pulled a pair of heavy pliers from his back pocket and began the grueling, tedious work of wrestling the bent lags out of the wood. The rest of the crew walked past, throwing him confused glances, but he waved them off. He never said a word. Later that evening, sitting on the tailgate of my truck in the dusty parking lot, I pulled out my phone. I texted Torin, a buddy of mine who worked on Bram's framing crew. Did the big guy suspect anyone today? Torin's reply came a minute later. Nah, he just said the floor fought back. Why? What did you do? I locked my screen, a triumphant smile spreading across my face. I had won. I had delivered a flawless execution of Jobsite savagery completely undetected, or so I thought. The next morning the air was crisp, the marine layer hanging thick over the steel beams. I was laying out top plates for a new interior wall when a shadow fell over my blueprints. I looked up. Bram was standing there. He wasn't wearing his tool pouches. Instead, he held a single, bent 8-inch lag screw between his thick fingers. He didn't look angry. In fact, the infuriating smirk was completely gone, replaced by a look of profound, genuine respect. 8 inches, he said, his voice a deep baritone that seemed to vibrate in the damp morning air. You didn't just want to inconvenience me, Saskia. You wanted to send a message. My heart did a strange, completely uninvited stutter against my ribs. He knew. I stood up straight, squaring my shoulders, refusing to back down. I have no idea what you're talking about. But theoretically, if someone were to nail your gear to the floor, maybe it was the universe's way of telling you to use your own damn ladder. Bram took a step closer. The scent of him, sawdust, old leather, and a hint of peppermint, cut through the industrial smells of the site. Theoretically, he murmured, tossing the heavy screw into the air and catching it, it was the most brilliant piece of retaliation I've ever seen on a residential site. He paused, his dark eyes locking onto mine, the intensity in them sudden and disarming. And theoretically, I might have taken your ladder just to see what you would do. You've been ignoring me for 3 months. I stared at him, my brain stalling. You stole a ladder. To get my attention. I'm a carpenter, he said, stepping into my space close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. I build things. Sometimes you have to tear something down to see if the foundation is strong enough to hold what comes next. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a curl of wood shaving off the collar of my flannel shirt. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight down my spine. Your foundation is terrifyingly strong. From that morning on, the dynamic shifted. The unspoken tension that had hovered between us morphed into a chaotic, flirtatious war. Residential framing has a savagery to it that commercial steel stud work lacks, and we leaned into it entirely. When I left my heavy tool cart unattended, I returned to find it tied to the ceiling rafters with heavy-duty rope. I retaliated by telling a green apprentice to go ask Bram for the board stretcher, resulting in Bram spending 20 minutes trying to explain the laws of physics to a teenager. The crew watched our escalating war with equal parts amusement and terror. Torin, the foreman, once intercepted an electrician's delivery of wire that was blocking our path and used the crane to hoist it onto the roof, just to impress me. But Bram outdid him by bringing me a perfectly black coffee every morning, memorizing exactly how I liked it. The grime and the exhaustion of the job melted away during our lunches. We would sit on the edge of the unframed elevator shaft, legs dangling over the abyss, eating sandwiches with dust on our hands, talking about everything and nothing. I learned about his father, a cabinet maker who taught him to respect the wood. He learned about my struggles, the constant battle to prove my worth in a world built for men. He never offered pity, only an unwavering, solid belief in my competence. The climax of our silent dance came during the final week of framing. We were rushing to finish the roof trusses before a massive storm front rolled in. The wind was howling, rattling the sheer panels, making the narrow beams treacherous. I was balancing on a top plate, struggling to align a heavy truss while the wind fought me. My boots slipped on a patch of sawdust. I didn't fall far, just dropped to straddle the beam, but the heavy truss swung wildly. Before it could snap the bracing, Bram was there. He vaulted up the scaffolding with terrifying speed, wrapping one massive arm around the timber, stopping its momentum dead, his chest heaving. He looked at me, his face pale beneath the tan, the wind whipping his dark hair. "You okay?" I nodded, my pulse hammering in my throat, breathless from the near miss and the sudden proximity of him. "I had it." "I know you did," he said fiercely, securing the truss with a temporary brace. He didn't climb down. He moved along the beam until he was sitting right in front of me, the drop to the ground forgotten, the howling wind fading into the background. He reached out, his rough hands framing my face, his thumbs wiping away a streak of dirt from my cheek. "I'm tired of fighting you, Saskia," he murmured, his gaze dropping to my lips. "I thought you liked the war," I breathed, my hands finding the solid, warm weight of his shoulders. "I like you," he corrected softly. "I like the way you don't back down. I like that you nailed my gear to the floor instead of whining about it. I like everything about you." He didn't wait for a response. He leaned in and his mouth found mine. The kiss was like the rest of him, solid, demanding, and incredibly grounding. Amidst the smell of pine pitch and impending rain, balancing on a narrow beam 60 feet in the air, I kissed him back, pulling him closer, anchoring myself to the man who had stolen my ladder and somehow managed to steal my heart. We finished the roof that day, working in perfect, unspoken tandem. The job eventually ended, as all jobs do, transitioning from raw wood to drywall and paint. I eventually moved on to commercial work, trading the savagery of residential wood framing for steel studs and gypcrete floors, where the pranks are fewer and the environment a little colder. But the foundation Bram and I built on that dusty 5th floor remained unshakable. Navigating a world where you are the anomaly requires a delicate balance of grace and absolute savagery. You have to know when to let things slide and when to pull out the impact driver and the 8-inch lags. Respect isn't handed out in a male-dominated field. It is earned, sometimes through sweat, sometimes through flawless retaliation. But more importantly, true strength is recognizing when someone isn't challenging you to break you, but pushing you to see how incredibly strong you really are. If you enjoyed this story of Jobsite revenge turned romance, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and tell me in the comments. What is the most creative prank you've ever witnessed at work? Keep building your foundations, and I'll see you in the next video.